back, air crews, to the American Red Cross's Masters of the Air Law of Armed Conflict debrief. I'm Thomas Harper. I'm Senior Counsel for International Humanitarian Law here at American Red Cross's national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to bring you part two of our Masters of the Air legal series, where we dissect all the big law of armed conflict issues seen in Masters of the Air as a way of better understanding how the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, works in the world. And we're going to start with a really interesting issue, and one that pertains to some scenes that we see throughout the first couple episodes of Masters of the Air, and that's the business of kids in and around the airfield, on the tarmac. We see that the 100th Bomb Group is stationed in Britain, not out at some remote installation away from civilization. No, they are right in the midst of the British population. In fact, when the bomb group arrives in Britain, as we saw in our earlier episode, the civilians in the area rush to greet the American airmen. And these two children, including Sammy here on the left, spend a lot of time in and around the airfield. They live close by. It's a way to kill time and do something interesting. And they spend a lot of time not just kind of wandering around and watching from a distance, but they're right around with the air crews, including Sergeant Lemmons there on the right. So it begs the question from a legal perspective, can kids be combatants? So generally speaking, in the law of war, law of armed conflict, we want to target combatants. That's who we want to use military force against. And we want to avoid intentionally targeting civilians. That's from a humanitarian perspective. We don't want the innocent to suffer during armed conflict, except in scenarios where it's just absolutely unavoidable, collateral damage, that sort of thing. But at a baseline, can children be combatants? And the general rule, which should be no surprise, is that children are civilians and civilians can't be intentionally targeted. The law treats an IHL, even in 1943, so before the four Geneva Conventions that followed after the war, children are lumped in right with civilians, right? They are especially vulnerable during armed conflict. And you don't need any special protection beyond that. You can't intentionally target children any more than you can other civilians in and around battlefields. But there's a couple twists with regard to Sammy and his friend here. And the first is the business that they're not just sitting at home playing a game in their front yard. No, they are around Sergeant Lemmon. They're around the bomb crews of the 100th Bomb Group. They are co-located effectively with soldiers. That's where they spend their time willingly. They know that there's a war going on. Yes, they're kids, but they're around soldiers from a war perspective. How can you not be able to target them based on that? Doesn't being around soldiers change their status, so to speak? And I say status because legal status, who you are on the battlefield, matters a great deal in terms of whether you can be targeted. And really, the law is concerned with two categories, right? That's it under IHL. You are either a civilian or you're a combatant. There are no other categories. And the thing about civilians is that there are a couple presumptions in place that the law has. One of those is that if there's any doubt about whether you're a civilian, so if there's some sort of gray area about you, what you look like, what you're doing, etc., the presumption under the law is that you're a civilian. You don't presume that someone's a combatant and then ask questions later about whether they might be a civilian. That's your starting point. The other foundational assumption here is that under IHL, the business of being around soldiers, simply having combatants near you, whether you're willingly on a base like these kids here, or say you're living in vicinity of a base. So here in the United States, we have military bases all across the country in communities. The fact that you live near a military base doesn't automatically make you a combatant. The fact that you visit a military base, you drive on, the fact that you may interact with soldiers, maybe you have a soldier or a service member in your family. Under the law, under the law of war, that doesn't change your status. That doesn't magically turn you into a soldier. So for these kids, they are free to go around this base. And is it a risky proposition? Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't provide a shield for the 100th Bomb Group or this airfield to not be attacked, but it also doesn't magically transform Sammy and his friend into soldiers. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, there's an additional wrinkle here, Thomas. These kids aren't just kind of wandering around and doing sightseeing. They're actually interacting with Sergeant Lemmons and the crewmen. They're actually helping them. In fact, in this episode, we see them help clear some oil off of one of the landing pads in this great scene where they light it on fire, kind of like the classic draw to get some kids to help you with an otherwise pretty crummy task. And not only are they helping with a sort of a piece of the war, right? Like this is maintenance of the airfield, sort of a critical task for Sergeant Lemmons and his team. But look at what Sammy's wearing. Sammy's wearing a uniform. Doesn't the business of helping soldiers, maybe even wearing their uniform, change these kids into combatants? Maybe it doesn't do that to everyone else. Maybe the average civilian out there wandering around the airfield isn't that, but these kids are doing something different. They're taking active part, right? Well, not quite, right? So under the law, it recognizes that civilians can lose their civilian status. Civilians can take part in conflict, in hostilities. They can directly participate and therefore lose that protected civilian status and by extension be intentionally targeted during that conflict. Now, that's a deep rabbit hole in terms of what constitutes direct participation in hostilities. And it's important to note that status change, that loss of protection, it can happen to kids too. The law carves out a lot of special protections for children, but the law of war also is practical in recognizing that children can and do unfortunately participate in armed conflict. The business of child soldiers is an ongoing and just terrible problem that our world has to deal with. But that's not really what's happening here. Yes, Sammy is wearing a uniform. Yes, they're taking part in clearing out a pad to help facilitate maintenance for these B-17s that are going to be coming back. They need that landing pad safe. You don't want a lot of volatile chemicals that could ignite and maybe destroy the plane or hurt soldiers there. So are they contributing to sort of military effectiveness and activity here by burning off that stuff on the landing pad? Sure, I guess. But that is not the same as picking up a weapon and firing it. It's not the same as helping the crews load bombs onto the B-17s in anticipation of a mission. This is just very low grade. In fact, it is just a fun thing for the kids to do. Sergeant Lemmons is not bringing these kids onto the landing pad and having them do this because he needs 2 extra crew members and he needs these kids to be soldiers. He's trying to entertain them. They're having fun, and he does it in sort of the classic way that would hook any boy about these kids' age, which is like, hey, do you want to play with fire? Do you want to light the ground on fire? So this, under no circumstances, constitutes direct participation in hostilities. Even the fact that he's wearing the uniform just as a measure of trying to be cool and be sort of one of the gang, so to speak, it doesn't change Sammy or his friend into soldiers. And under the law of armed conflict, they would still be civilians. They would still have that protected status. Now, there's still danger to them because someone like Sergeant Lemmons and his crew, they're still targetable. They're U.S. Army soldiers. And even though Lemmons, he's 19, he's barely an adult himself, but they're combatants. They're members of the U.S. Armed Forces. It is a war. And so they could be targeted. This is an airfield. It is a military installation. It is a legitimate military target under the law. So German forces could absolutely target Lemmons. They could target his crew. They could target that airfield, regardless of whether the civilians are around. That doesn't mean that they could just kill any civilians they want in pursuit of that target. There's still some other considerations under the law that have to be met, but understand that it's not some sort of human shield that protects the base under all circumstances, and that's not what's happening here. So you can't target the kids. The other really interesting issue that kind of comes to a head in part two of the series here is the business of the U.S.'s strategy of daylight bombing. Now, I mentioned that this was going to be an issue in our last episode, and it really comes to fruition here because you have this great exchange between some RAF pilots, the Royal Air Force, and the Americans from the 100th Bomb Group. And the Brits sort of snarkily remarked that the Americans are losing a lot of pilots, that there would be more of them around on the other side of the table if they would just bomb at night as the Brits do. And in his narration, Crosby explains that the British, who had been at war with the Nazis for a number of years up to that point, were carrying out nighttime area bombing. So this idea of targeting sort of a patch of land and just bombing whatever was in that sphere, partly because you can't see what you're doing at night and lacking some of the precision weaponry that we have now in the 21st century. They just hit whatever, and as the pilot explains, they bomb at night because it doesn't matter what they hit. They just care that it's German. Crosby explains that the Americans opted for precision bombing techniques in order to hit their targets. And you see that kind of bubble up in this scene here where the Americans threw Bucky remarked that they're not even hitting their targets. They're not, the implication is that the British bombing campaign isn't really being all that effective. They're not taking out any real component of the German war machine. They're just wrecking things. And the British explain that it's just maths, right? It's like, because there's more than one. It's probably my favorite moment of this entire episode. But it brings us back to a fundamental principle that we've talked about in an earlier episode, and that's the business of distinction. So to quickly recap, the rule of distinction, and understand that distinction is one of these core principles that undergird all of IHL. So they're present in the Geneva Conventions, they're baked into the Hague Conventions, they're baked into military practice, etc. And here, what we're talking about, just like with the business of children on the tarmac, is that we're obligated as a party to an armed conflict to distinguish when we use force between combatants and civilians or civilian objects or military objectives. That cuts to the core of the difference in philosophy here between the Americans and the British. And I mentioned last episode in the context of the Bremen bombing raid, the business of positive identification. And so you have this layering effect here where the Americans are embarking on daylight bombing because it is really the only way that with the equipment that they have, they can ensure that precision targeting that's necessary to destroy their legitimate military targets. So we've seen them already target U-boat pens. They have another mission at the end of this episode. And the idea here is that not only does the law require the business of distinction, the law, understand, doesn't require you to conduct your operation in a certain way. So you're not going to find any provision in the Geneva Conventions, Hague, etc., that's going to say, well, if you're going to conduct a bombing campaign, you've got to do it during the day. It doesn't get into that nuance. IHL doesn't operate to dictate the nuances of how you conduct a military operation. Instead, it's going to provide a framework, and it's up to the military that's conducting the operation or using force to decide how to fit their operation within the framework of the law. The Americans in this instance chose to conduct daylight bombing raids, partially because it helped them distinguish their targets. So we want to hit a U-boat pen, say in Bremen, and not the entire city of Bremen. The whole city is not the military target here. It's the German submarines and their operations there. And understand that all of Europe is not Nazi Germany here. Even Nazi Germany is not just 100% Nazi military bases or camps, etc. here. They control, as of 1943, when this episode takes place, a massive swath of territory. And in this episode, we see the 100th target not some target deep within Germany, but they target an area within Norway. So a normal European country that just happens to be under the Nazi boot heel. And across Europe, yes, you have a ton of Nazis who are operating land, sea, and air forces that are perfectly legitimate military targets. But it's not as black and white as that seems across the board, because you have just millions of European civilians, including in this episode in Norway, civilians who are under occupation. They can't get out. They are still living their lives. They haven't converted and just become German soldiers. Whether they're resisting Nazi occupation or not really is irrelevant. And for the Americans, their goal is to target and destroy the former. They want to destroy Nazi forces, but it does them no good. And in fact, it's beyond the scope of the law or beyond the reach of the law to target those civilians. It's not only outside the bounds of the law to do so, but if you're intentionally targeting civilians, I would submit to you that you're really degrading your war effort. It can have an impact on morale. It can have a negative impact on what you're trying to achieve. After all, the Americans, and by extension, the Allied forces, they're there to throw off the reins of a really awful, terrible regime in the Nazis. If they were to go in and simply kill European civilians at will, callously, recklessly, negligently, just in the aim of trying to kill Nazis, think about that from a European civilian's standpoint. Is this liberating force truly someone who's necessarily better? In some ways, you could see that a civilian that's sitting there on the receiving end of just relentless, indiscriminate bombing campaigns might question that, and that would start to really undermine what the Allies are trying to achieve. They want to inspire resistance in civilians. They want to restore freedom. They want to restore the rule of law, and to do that, you have to operate within some boundaries here. And this distinction between the British and the Americans is not necessarily one where the British are doing something patently illegal and the Americans are just abiding by the law. It's not as simple as that. But understand that generally speaking, the law requires you to avoid indiscriminate bombing. The law requires you to avoid intentionally, that word is critical, intentionally targeting civilians, so that we use the force that's necessary to destroy legitimate military objectives. And so the British in their bombing campaign, their area bombing at night, may be accomplishing some of that. I don't think there was an instance where the British, at least in the context of this episode, were seeking to go just kill wantonly, and if they killed civilians, like that was the purpose of it. But their view of collateral damage, their view of what was necessary to achieve their end goal, especially against an enemy that they had been just in a brutal fight against for years, a fight for their very existence, their calculus was different than the Americans. Now, what's important here is a piece of technology that's center stage through this episode and the rest of the Masters of the Air, and that's the Norden bomb sight. I love the call out by Crosby that this piece of technology, this piece of American technology, was granted equal secrecy to the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. This is the device that made that precision daylight bombing even possible. Without getting into a ton of technical specifics, understand that the key aspect of the Norden bomb sight was that it effectively was like a primitive computer. In fact, it used an analog computer, but it had the ability to adjust and account for things like airspeed, trajectory, wind, etc., to bring bombs onto target. And that was really critical for the Americans to achieve that sort of purpose of distinguishing between the legitimate military targets that they were trying to hit and avoid causing just needless, reckless collateral damage here. So it's a manifestation of what we were trying to achieve here. And again, understand that the Americans didn't develop the Norden bomb sight because the law of war required this kind of technology. This is the layering of what the law requires and what you're trying to achieve tactically through how you conduct your operations, because so often those go hand in hand. And I mentioned that linkage in our last episode in the context of the Bremen raid and that business of the law of war versus rules of engagement, how we shape the battlefield, how commanders shape the battlefield. And so it's worth reiterating that sort of layering here because it influences and it explains the business of why we're doing these daylight bombing campaigns. So at that outer perimeter, you have just anything you could possibly do. So a night raid, area bombing, etc. Anything you could do to achieve your objective during war is that outer limit. You dial that in just a little bit and you have the boundaries of IHL, the boundaries of the law of war. And so you're going to see that the law places some limits for humanitarian purposes on what you're able to do. So again, I explained that the law of war doesn't necessarily outlaw what the British were doing, right? The law of war is going to have some core provisions like avoiding intentionally targeting civilians, avoiding indiscriminate attacks, etc. But that still leaves a lot of leeway, a lot of flexibility to conduct operations. If you dial it in further, then you have that red circle there, which are rules of engagement. Rules of engagement are not set by the law of war. Rules of engagement are not going to be found in the Geneva Conventions, Hague, etc. ROE, as we call it for short, are going to be set by commanders, by generals or colonels, or whoever has the authority to design and conduct and execute a military operation. And ROE exists to achieve certain objectives. Yes, ROE often help us comply with the law of war when we're conducting military operations. But also ROE helps tactically or strategically achieve objectives. I mentioned the business of the overall Allied goal of throwing off Nazi oppression, of inspiring resistance and everything else against the Nazi regime in Fortress Europe. Well, you're going to degrade that. You're going to counteract that entire mission if you're doing things that might be otherwise legal under the law of war, but might cause a civilian, as I mentioned, to question your motives, to question whether what you're doing is really something that civilians should get behind, right? So an ROE is a tool that a commander is going to use to shape the battlefield. So a great example of that is the daylight bombing campaign. American brass said, we're going to conduct this. We have the ability technologically to do so because of the Norden bomb site. And we're going to do it because it helps us ensure that we are degrading the Nazi war machine. So we're destroying their U-boat bases. We're blowing up ball bearing factories. We're blowing up actual Nazi military machinery, etc. Instead of just wrecking cities, instead of killing needlessly civilians, etc., and not achieving those military objectives, so leaving the Nazi war machine to fight another day, or by extension, causing the civilians to not want to get behind the Allied war effort and to maybe be sympathetic to at least some of the things that the Nazis were doing at the time. So ROE is that toolkit that's going to differ depending on the mission. It's going to differ depending on the conflict. But the Allies are using it here in their daylight bombing campaign. It's not necessarily without controversy, right? Even the American pilots, as we'll see in future episodes, get really frustrated with the nature of how they're attacking, the frequency with which they're attacking, especially juxtaposed against the British, who are seemingly more safe flying at night, even if they're not going to be precise and accurate in their targeting. Thanks for coming to our latest episode. We'll be back next week to cover episode 3 of Masters of the Air. If you want to find out more about our program and volunteer opportunities, follow that QR code or go to our website at redcross.org/IHL. We have a lot of information. We have information about our upcoming events. Thank you, and we'll report in for duty for our next legal debrief next week.